Hey, hi everybody. Welcome back to Hot Dad Reads. You know, been a couple of days. That's what happens sometimes. But we're back. We're taking our time. We're not in any rush. My gosh, we're more like a sixth of the way through Les Miserables. We're just an eighth of the way through last week. Man, actually reading the book tends to make the book go by pretty quickly. We've had some new followers and new viewers and whatnot, so it's nice to see you all. It's very hot in my house, so I'm wearing a tank top. I kind of always enjoyed the more, I'm going to show up and put on a jacket and a tie or something, but that was when it was cold. It's not cold anymore. It's hard to wear a jacket indoors while reading with the lights on me for 2 hours. But, there's an extra light on today, but I don't really mind it so much right now. Anyways, what's it doing for shadows? No? A little bit behind me. That's not so bad. But what do we do here? Basically, I'm reading all the books that I was supposed to read back in high school, and I never did. And I assume, because whenever I mention this idea to people, they say, "Oh man, same." So come join me as I read all of the homework that we never did. If you're following me on YouTube, then you're probably somewhere in the age of 20 years old in there. So these are all going to be fun books that maybe you already love them, maybe you're familiar with them, maybe you've already read them 1,000 times, but here we go, reading them together again. And if you're younger than that, hey, let me do your homework for you. That's the whole plan here. We are reading Les Miserables by Victor Hugo with a new translation by Christine Doniger. It's hard to say exactly where we are. Basically, Jean Valjean is headed to Arras in order to track down another Jean Valjean who is on trial and about to go to prison in his place. So, we're like 8 songs in. Anyway, Chapter 6. Soir Simplice is put to the test. Meanwhile, at that very moment, Fantine was full of joy. She had had a very bad night. Terrible coughing. Her fever worse than ever. She had had nightmares. In the morning, when the doctor came, she was delirious. He looked alarmed and asked to be informed as soon as Monsieur Madeleine arrived. All morning she was dejected, said little, plucked at her sheets, murmuring in a low voice what sounded like calculations of distances. Her eyes were sunken and staring. They seemed almost lifeless. Then, now and again, they lit up and shone like stars. Seemingly at the approach of a certain dark hour, the light of heaven fills those whom the earth's light is deserting. Oh, it's a cat. Surprise, there's a cat. Oh, that's right. I meant to move Hot Dad Reads over to here. I'll get that. Every time Soir Simplice asked her how she felt, she invariably replied, "Fine. I'd like to see Monsieur Madeleine." A few months earlier, when Fantine had just lost the last of her modesty, the last of her shame, the last of her joy, she was the mere shadow of herself. Now she was the ghost of herself. Physical malady had completed the work of moral malady. This creature of 25 had a lined brow, wasted cheeks, pinched nostrils, loose teeth, a leaden complexion, a scraggy neck, prominent shoulder blades, weak limbs, a sallow complexion, and her blonde hair now grew sprinkled with gray. Alas, how illness contrives to imitate old age. At midday the doctor returned, issued some instructions, inquired whether Monsieur le Maire had turned up at the infirmary, and shook his head. Monsieur Madeleine usually came to see the patient at 3 o'clock. As promptness was a kindness, he was prompt. At about 2:30, Fantine began to fret. In the space of 20 minutes, she asked the nun more than 10 times, "What time is it, sister?" 3 o'clock struck. At the third stroke, Fantine sat bolt upright, she who as a rule could barely move in her bed, and in a convulsive gesture joined together her two bony yellow hands, and the nun heard emerging from her chest one of those deep sighs that seemed to throw off the weight of despondency. Then Fantine turned and gazed at the door. No one came in. The door did not open. She remained like this for a quarter of an hour, her eyes riveted on the door, motionless and as if holding her breath. The nun dared not speak to her. The clock struck 3:15. Fantine sank back on her pillow. She said nothing and began to pluck at her sheet again. Half an hour passed, then an hour. No one came. Every time the clock struck, Fantine sat up and looked towards the door, then fell back again. It was clear what she was thinking, but she mentioned no name, made no complaint, voiced no criticism, but she coughed mournfully. It seemed as though something dark was descending on her. She was ghastly pale, and her lips were blue. Occasionally she smiled. 5 o'clock struck. Then the nun heard her say very quietly and softly, "But it's wrong of him not to come today, since I'll be gone tomorrow." Soir Simplice herself was surprised at Monsieur Madeleine's delay. In the meantime, Fantine was staring up at the canopy above her bed. She seemed to be trying to recall something. All at once she began to sing in a voice as faint as a whisper. The nun listened. This is what Fantine was singing. "We shall buy such pretty things as we stroll down the avenues. Roses are red, cornflowers are blue. Cornflowers are blue, my heart is true. Yesterday the Virgin Mary by my stove and her embroidered mantle stood. You one day prayed for a child to love. I have it hidden beneath my veil, she said. Run to town and fetch some cloth, buy some thread and buy a thimble. We shall buy such pretty things as we stroll down the avenues. Dear Blessed Virgin, beside my stove I've placed a herringboned cradle. A herringboned cradle. Though God were to give me his loveliest star, the child you have given me is better by far. What's to be done with this cloth, ma'am? Use it to dress my newborn babe. Roses are red, cornflowers are blue. Cornflowers are blue, my heart is true. Wash this cloth. Where? In the stream? Do not spoil it, keep it clean, and make a pretty skirt and vest of it. With flowers all over, I'll embroider it. The child's no more. What now, ma'am? Use it for my winding sheet. We shall buy such pretty things as we stroll down the avenues. Roses are red, cornflowers are blue. Cornflowers are blue, my heart is true. This song was an old lullaby with which she once used to sing her little Cosette to sleep, and it had not come to mind in all the 5 years she had been parted from her child. She sang it in so sad a voice, and to so sweet a tune, it was enough to make even a nun cry. Inured to austerity, the sister felt a tear welling in her eye. The clock struck 6. Fantine seemed not to hear. She seemed no longer to be paying attention to anything around her. Soir Simplice sent a ward maid to inquire of the factory doorkeeper whether the mayor had returned, and if he would not be coming up to the infirmary soon. The girl was back within a few minutes. Fantine was still lying motionless, and seemed absorbed in her own thoughts. The ward maid very quietly told Soir Simplice that Monsieur le Maire had left before 6 that morning in a little tilbury harnessed to a white horse, in this cold weather, that he had gone alone without even a driver, that no one knows what road he had taken. Some people said they had seen him take the turning for the road to Arras, and others insisted they had passed him on the road to Paris. That when he left, he had been very mild-mannered, as usual, and he had merely told the doorkeeper not to expect him back tonight. While the two women stood whispering with their backs turned to Fantine's bed, the nun questioning, the maid surmising, Fantine, with the feverish animation of certain organic diseases that combines good health's freedom of movement with the frightful emaciation of death, had got into a kneeling position on her bed, her two clenched fists resting on the bolsters, and with her head poking through the opening in the curtains, she listened. She cried out suddenly, "You're talking about Monsieur Madeleine. Why are you whispering? What's he done? Why doesn't he come?" Her voice was so abrupt and harsh, the two women thought it was a man's voice they heard. They turned round in alarm. "Go on, answer me!" cried Fantine. The maid stammered, "The doorkeeper told me he couldn't come today." "My child," said the nun, "calm yourself. Lie down." Without changing her position, Fantine continued to speak loudly and in a tone of voice at once imperious and heartrending. "He can't come. Why not? You know the reason. You're whispering about it to each other. I want to be told." The maid quickly said in the nun's ear, "Tell her he's busy with the city council." Soir Simplice flushed a little. What the maid suggested was a lie. On the other hand, it seemed clear to her that telling this sick woman the truth would surely be a terrible blow to her, and this was of serious consequence in Fantine's present state. That flush did not last long. With her calm, sad gaze, the sister looked up at Fantine and said, "Monsieur le Maire has gone." Fantine straightened up and sat back on her heels. Her eyes sparkled. Sublime joy illuminated that tragic face. "Gone?" she cried. "He's gone to fetch Cosette!" Then she raised her arms to heaven, and her whole face became indescribable. Her lips moved. She was praying under her breath. When she had finished her prayer, she said, "I'll lie down now, sister. I'll do whatever I am asked to. I behaved badly just now. I'm sorry I shouted like that. It was wrong to shout. I know full well, my dear sister, but you see I am very happy. The good Lord is kind. Monsieur Madeleine is kind. Just think, he's gone to Montfermeil to fetch my little Cosette." She lay down again, helped the nun to arrange the pillows, and kissed the little silver cross that she wore round her neck and that Soir Simplice had given her. "My child," said the nun, "try to rest now, and don't talk any more." Fantine took the nun's hand in her own clammy hands, and it pained the nun to feel this sweat on her. "He set out this morning for Paris. Actually, he doesn't even need to go through Paris. Montfermeil lies a little to the left on the way here. Do you remember how he said to me yesterday, when I was talking to him about Cosette, 'Soon, soon'? He wants it to be a surprise for me. You know he made me sign a letter to get her back from the Thénardiers. They won't have any objection, will they? They'll give her back. Since they've been paid, the authorities wouldn't allow anyone to keep a child once they've been paid off. Don't shush me, sister. I'm extremely happy. I feel very well. I'm not at all in pain now. I'm going to see Cosette again. I even feel quite hungry. It's nearly 5 years since I last saw her. You can't imagine, sister, how much they mean to you, children. And then she'll be so pretty, you'll see. I tell you, she has such lovely little pink fingers. For a start, she'll have very beautiful hands. At the age of 1, she had tiny hands like that. She must be tall now. 7 years old, if you please. She's a young lady. I call her Cosette, but her name's Euphrasie. You know, this morning I was looking at the dust on the chimney-piece, and I just had this wonderful feeling I'd be seeing Cosette again soon. God, what a mistake to go years without seeing your children. We really ought to bear in mind that life's not eternal. Oh, how kind Monsieur le Maire to have gone. It's true, it's very cold. Had he his cloak, at least? He'll be here tomorrow, won't he? Tomorrow will be a day of celebration. Tomorrow morning, sister, you must remind me to put on my little cap with the lace trim. It's a village, Montfermeil. I made that journey on foot once. It was a very long way from me, but the coaches go very quickly. You'll be here tomorrow with Cosette. How far is it from here to Montfermeil? The sister, who had no idea of distances, replied, "Oh, I should think he might be here by tomorrow." "Tomorrow? Tomorrow," said Fantine. "I'll see Cosette tomorrow. You see, sister, the dear Lord's dear sister, I'm not ill anymore. I'm so excited I could dance if anyone wanted." Whoever had seen her a quarter of an hour earlier would have been at a complete loss to understand. She was now looking quite rosy. She spoke in a bright and natural voice. Her face was one big smile. Now and then she laughed, murmuring quietly to herself. Maternal joy is almost childlike joy. "Well," said the nun, "now you're happy. Do as I say, and no more talking." Fantine laid her head on the pillow, and said in a subdued voice, "Yes, lie down again. Be good, since you're going to be with your child again. Sois Simplice is right. Everyone here is right." And then, without stirring, without moving her head, she began to look all around with her eyes wide open and an expression of delight, and said not another word. The nun closed the curtains around her, hoping she would doze off. Between 7 and 8 o'clock the doctor came. Not hearing a sound, and thinking Fantine was asleep, he came in quietly and went over to her bed on tiptoe. He parted the curtains, and by the glow of the nightlight he saw Fantine's big, calm eyes staring at him. She said, "Monsieur, she will be allowed to sleep beside me in the little bed, won't she?" The doctor thought she was raving. She added, "Well, look, there's just not enough room. Well, look, there's just enough room." The doctor took Soir Simplice aside, and she explained the situation, that Monsieur Madeleine was away for a day or two, and without knowing for sure, they thought they should not disabuse the patient, who believed Monsieur le Maire had gone to Montfermeil. After all, it was possible she had guessed correctly. The doctor agreed. He returned to Fantine's bedside. She continued, "You see, when she wakes up in the morning, I'll say good morning to the poor little pet, and when I can't sleep at night, I hear her sleeping. It'll do me good, the lovely sweet sound of her breathing." "Give me your hand," said the doctor. She held out her arm, and exclaimed, laughing, "Now, of course, it's true. You don't know. The thing is, I'm cured. Cosette will be here tomorrow." The doctor was surprised. She was better. She was breathing more easily. Her pulse was stronger. Some kind of unexpected vitality all of a sudden reanimated this poor, exhausted creature. "Doctor," she went on, "did sister tell you that Monsieur le Maire has gone on to fetch the little mite?" The doctor advised silence and the avoidance of any emotional distress. He prescribed an infusion of cinchona and a calmative draught in the event of a recurrence of fever during the night. As he was leaving, he said to the nun, "She's doing better. If by some good fortune the mayor were to turn up tomorrow with the child, who knows? There are some truly astonishing recoveries. Great joys have been known to arrest illnesses. Of course, I know this is an organic disease and far advanced, but it's all such a mystery. We may yet save her." Having a sip, moving on to the next chapter. Chapter 7. The traveler on arrival makes sure of being able to leave. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening when the cart we left en route entered the gateway of the Hotel de la Poste in Arras. The man we had been following till now climbed down, responded in a distracted way to the eagerness of the staff at the inn to be helpful, sent back the extra horse, and personally led the little white horse to the stable. Then he pushed open the door of a billiard room on the ground floor, sat down, and rested his elbows on the table. It had taken him 14 hours to make this journey that he had expected to complete in 6. He did not blame himself. It was not his fault, but in his heart of hearts, he was not sorry. The landlady of the hotel came in. "Is Monsieur staying the night? Will Monsieur be having supper?" He shook his head. "The groom says Monsieur's horse is very tired." At this point he broke his silence. "Will the horse not be able to set off again tomorrow morning?" "Oh, Monsieur, that horse needs at least 2 days' rest," he asked. "Isn't this the post house?" "Yes, Monsieur." The landlady took him to the office. He showed his passport and inquired whether it was possible to return that same night to Montreuil-sur-Mer by the mail coach. It so happened that the seat beside the postman was free. He booked it and paid for it. "Monsieur," said the clerk. I remembered. It's pronounced Clark in British. "Be here without fail, ready to leave punctually at 1 o'clock in the morning." This done, he left the hotel and began to walk through the town. He was not familiar with Arras. The streets were dark, and he did not know where he was going. Yet he seemed determined not to ask directions of any passers-by. He crossed the little river Crinchin and found himself in a labyrinth of narrow lanes where he lost his way. A townsman was walking along with a lantern. After some hesitation, he made up his mind to speak to this man, not without having first looked ahead and behind, as though afraid someone might hear the question he was about to ask. "Monsieur," he said, "where are the law courts, if you please?" "You're a stranger to the town, monsieur," replied the gentleman, who was quite elderly. "Well, follow me. I'm actually going in the direction of the law courts. That's to say, in the direction of the prefectural building, because the law courts are under repair at the moment, and in the meantime trials are being held at the prefecture." All right. Hello. It's a lot of dancing little dragon dudes. Is it there the assizes are held?" he asked. "Indeed, monsieur. You see, where the prefecture is today was the bishop's palace before the Revolution. Monsieur de Cossey, who was bishop in 82, had a great hall built there. It's in that great hall that the court sits." The man said to him as they walked along, "If it's a trial that monsieur wants to watch, it's rather late. Usually the sittings end at 6 o'clock. However, when they came to the main square, the man pointed out to him 4 long lighted windows in the facade of a huge dark building. "Upon my word, monsieur, you're not too late. You're in luck. Do you see those 4 windows? That's the court of assizes. It's lit up, so it's not over. The case must have dragged on, and they're having an evening hearing. Have you an interest in this case? Is it a criminal trial? Are you a witness?" He replied, "I haven't come for any trial. I just need to speak to a lawyer." "That's different," said the man. "Look, monsieur, that's the door there. Where's the sentry standing? You just have to go up the main staircase." He followed the man's directions, and a few minutes later he was in a crowded hall where groups of people, along with robed lawyers, were whispering together here and there. It is always intimidating to see these congregations of men clad in black, murmuring among themselves in low voices outside the chambers of justice. Rarely do charity or pity result from all this talk. What result more often than not are convictions decided in advance. To the passing and fanciful observer, all these groups are like so many forbidden hives where buzzing spirits of some sort or other cooperate in the construction of all manner of sinister edifices. This spacious hall, illuminated by a single lamp, was formerly an antechamber of the episcopal palace and now served as the waiting hall. A double-paneled door, presently closed, separated it from the main hall in which the court was sitting. It was so ill-lit, he was not afraid to address the first lawyer he encountered. "Monsieur, what stage are they at?" he asked. "It's over," said the lawyer. Over? This word was repeated in such a tone of voice that the lawyer turned round. "Forgive me, monsieur, are you perhaps a relative?" "No, I don't know anyone here." "Has sentence been passed?" "Indeed, it was almost inevitable." "Penal servitude?" "For life." He continued in a voice so weak it was barely audible. "Identification was made, then?" "What identification?" replied the lawyer. "There was no identification to be made. The case was straightforward. The woman killed her child, infanticide was proven, the jury ruled out premeditation, she was sentenced to life imprisonment." "Then it's a woman?" he said. "But of course, the woman from Limoges. What is it you're talking about, then?" "Nothing. But if it's all over, why would the hall still be lit up?" "For the other case that began about 2 hours ago." "What other case?" "Oh, that one's also straightforward. Some sort of ruffian, a reoffender, a convicted felon up for stealing. I don't remember quite what his name is. Now, there's someone who looks like a villain. Just for having a face like that, I'd clap him in chains." "Monsieur, is there any chance of getting into the courtroom?" he said. "I really don't think so. It's very crowded. However, the hearing's been adjourned. There are some people who came out when the hearing resumes. You could try." "Where's the entrance?" "Oh, that big door over there." The lawyer left him. Within a few moments, he had experienced every possible emotion, almost simultaneously, almost conflated. This indifferent bystander's words had pierced his heart like icicles one moment, like jets of flame the next. When he saw that nothing was over, he breathed again. But he could not have said whether it was satisfaction or pain that he felt. He went and stood close to several groups and listened to what was being said. With a very full court roll, the presiding judge had selected for that same day 2 simple, straightforward cases. They had begun with the infanticide, and now they were dealing with the ex-convict, the reoffender, the old lag. This man had stolen some apples, though apparently this had not been proven conclusively. What had been proved was that he had already served a penal sentence at Toulon. This was what made things look bad for him. The questioning of the defendant was now ended, and the witness had testified, but still to come was the defense counsel and public prosecutors summing up. It was unlikely to be over before midnight. The man would probably be found guilty. The public prosecutor was very able and did not fail to secure convictions. He was a witty fellow who wrote verse. An usher stood by the door leading into the assize court. He inquired of this usher, "Monsieur, is the door going to open soon?" "It isn't going to open," said the usher. "What do you mean? Won't it open when the hearing resumes? Isn't the hearing returned? Isn't the hearing adjourned?" "The hearing has just resumed," replied the usher, "but the door is not going to open again." "Why not?" "Because the courtroom is full." "What? There isn't a single seat left?" "Not one. The door's closed. No one else can go in." Of course, the usher added after a pause, "There are still 2 or 3 places behind Monsieur le Président, but Monsieur le Président only lets public officials sit there." Having said this, the usher turned his back on him. He walked away with his head bowed, crossed the antechamber, and slowly descended the staircase as though hesitating at every step. He was probably debating with himself. The violent conflict that had been raging inside him since the day before was not yet over, and at every moment he went through some new crisis. When he got to the landing halfway down the stairs, he leaned back against the banister and crossed his arms. All of a sudden, he opened his frock coat, found his wallet, took out a pencil, tore out a sheet of paper, and on that sheet of paper, by the lamplight, scribbled down this line: Monsieur Madeleine, Mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer. Then he strode back upstairs, forced his way through the crowd, walked straight up to the usher, handed him the note, and said with authority, "Take this to Monsieur le Président." The usher took the note, glanced at it, and obeyed. Pausing for water. I'm going to turn off the air conditioning for a little bit, just to make sure it doesn't kick back on. I'll be right back. I know it sounds annoying with the air on, but it's so hot. I didn't want to turn it off while baby was sleeping. But it's off now. It's relatively better. And we have an hour and a half left. We'll be all right for an hour and a half. Pardon me. Chapter 8, Privileged Access. Though he was entirely unaware of it, the mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer enjoyed a kind of celebrity. After 7 years in which the reputations of his goodness filled the whole of Lower Boulonnais, it had eventually crossed the boundaries of a small community and spread into 2 or 3 neighboring départements. Aside from the considerable service he had rendered the chief town of Montreuil-sur-Mer itself by reviving the black glass industry, there was not one out of the 141 local municipalities in the arrondissement that did not owe some benefit to him. He had even succeeded in helping to foster, where necessary, the industries of other arrondissements. It was that he had, at one time or another, supported with his credit and his funding the Boulogne Tool Factory, Ferrand's mechanized linen mill, and the hydraulically powered looms at Boubert-Seconche. Just making up that French. No idea how it's pronounced. Monsieur Madeleine was a name everywhere mentioned with great esteem. Arras and Douai envied the fortunate little town of Montreuil-sur-Mer, its mayor. Montreuil-sur-Mer, its mayor. Mer. Douai's royal court judge, who was presiding over this session of the assizes at Arras, was no less familiar than anyone else with this name that was so profoundly and universally respected. When the usher, discreetly opening the door that connected the council chamber with the courtroom, bowed behind the judge's chair and handed him a piece of paper on which was written the line we have just read, adding, "This gentleman wishes to attend the hearing," the judge gave a deferential start, snatched up a pen, wrote a few words on the bottom of the piece of paper, and returned it to the usher, saying, "Show him in." The poor man whose history we are relating had remained at the door of the hall in exactly the same place and in exactly the same stance as the usher had left him. In the midst of his musings, he heard someone say to him, "Would Monsieur kindly do me the honor of following me?" It was the same usher who had turned his back on him only a moment earlier, and who was now bowing and scraping before him. At the same time, the usher handed him the piece of paper. He unfolded it, and, happening to be near the lamp, he was able to read it. The presiding judge of the Court of Assizes presents his respects to Monsieur Madeleine. He crushed the paper in his hand as if those words might have had for him a strange and bitter aftertaste. He followed the usher. A few minutes later he found himself alone in an austere-looking paneled room, lit by 2 candles set on a green baize table. He could still hear the last words spoken by the usher who had just left him. "Monsieur, you are now in the council chamber. You have only to turn the brass handle of that door, and you'll find yourself in the courtroom behind Monsieur le Président's chair." These words mingled in his thoughts with a vague memory of narrow corridors and dark staircases that he had just passed through. The usher had left him on his own. The final moment had come. He tried to gather his thoughts, but without succeeding. It is especially at those times when they most need to be attached to the painful realities of life that the threads of thought all break in the mind. He was in the very place where the judges deliberate and reach a verdict. With a dazed tranquility, he surveyed this quiet and forbidding room where so many lives had been destroyed, where his name was soon to reverberate, and through which his fate was now taking him. He stared at the wall, then stared at himself, wondering at this chamber and wondering at his being here. He had eaten nothing for more than 24 hours. He was exhausted by the jolting of the cart, but he did not feel it. It seemed to him that he did not feel anything. He approached a black frame that hung on the wall and contained, under glass, an old autographed letter of Jean-Nicolas Pache, minister and mayor of Paris, dated, no doubt mistakenly, 9 June, year 11, in which Pache sent the commune the list of ministers and deputies under house arrest. Anyone who might have seen him and observed him at that moment would probably have imagined that he found this letter very intriguing, for he did not take his eyes off it, and read it 2 or 3 times. He read it unknowingly, without paying any attention to it. He was thinking of Fantine and Cosette. While musing, he turned round, and his eyes fell on the brass handle of the door that separated him from the Assizes courtroom. He had almost forgotten about this door. His gaze, at first calm, settled on it, remained fastened on that brass handle, then became scared and intent, and little by little was stamped with terror. Beads of sweat seeped through his hair and trickled down his temples. At a certain moment, with a kind of authority mixed with rebellion, he made the indescribable gesture that expresses its meaning very well. "Damn it, who's forcing me to do this?" And then he wheeled round, saw before him the door he had come in by, went over to it, opened it, and walked out. He was no longer in that chamber. He was outside in a corridor, a long, narrow corridor, intersected with steps and passageways, turning this way and that, lighted here and there by lamps similar to the night lights of the sick. The corridor that had brought him here. He inhaled. He listened. Not a sound behind him. Not a sound ahead of him. Then he fled as if he were being chased. When he had turned several corners along this corridor, he listened again. There was still the same silence, and the same gloom around him. He was breathless. He was reeling. He leaned against the wall. The stone was cold. His sweat was icy on his brow. He drew himself up with a shiver. Then, standing there alone in the darkness, trembling with cold, and something else as well, perhaps, he pondered. He had been pondering the whole night. He had been pondering the whole day. All he could hear within him now was a voice that said, "Alas." A quarter of an hour went by like this. Finally he bowed his head, sighed with anguish, let his arms drop, and retraced his steps. He walked slowly and as though crushed. It was as if someone had caught up with him as he fled and was bringing him back. He re-entered the chamber. The first thing he saw was the doorknob. That round knob of polished brass shone for him like some terrible star. He stared at it as a lamb would stare into the eyes of a tiger. He could not tear his gaze away from it. From time to time, he took a step forward and moved closer to the door. Had he listened, he might have heard the sound, a kind of vague murmur that came from the next room, but he did not listen, and he did not hear. Without knowing how, he suddenly found himself at the door. He grabbed the knob convulsively. The door opened. He was inside the courtroom. I had a very good game of poker yesterday. I was at a tournament, and it's a very fast tournament. And having played it before, I literally thought, I could probably fold every hand and still make it to final table. Like, so many people are playing and so quickly and at such aggressive levels that, like, so many people will be eliminated by the time the blinds really get to be expensive. I could just hang out, get to final table, and, then play poker. But it was rebuy night, which meant that everyone got to play twice, myself included. And plus, like, sometimes I had great hands, Sometimes it's like, even if you're going to fold every hand, you get pocket kings, you're like, I can't fold this. This is great. But yeah. Good hands. A lot of luck. You get to a point in there where there's just not enough money and the blinds are so expensive that basically it's a coin flip every hand that you basically have to go all in every time. Madness. But, it's a tournament, so what are you going to do? But I won, so there's that. Chapter 9, Where Convictions Take Shape. He took a step forward, unconsciously closed the door behind him, and stood there, taking stock of what he saw. It was quite a spacious and dimly lit interior, now full of uproar, now full of silence, where all the ritual of a criminal trial was played out with shabby and dismal gravity in the midst of the crowd. At one end of the room, the one where he was standing, listless-looking magistrates in threadbare robes, biting their fingernails or closing their eyes. At the other end, a ragged throng, lawyers striking all sorts of attitudes, soldiers with stern but honest faces, old stained wood paneling, a dirty ceiling, tables covered with serge more yellow than green, finger-blackened doors, on nails driven into the paneling, tap-room lamps giving off more smoke than light. On the tables, candles and brass candlesticks. Gloom, ugliness, dreariness, and all this created an austere and imposing impression, for there was a sense here of that great human thing called the law, and of that great divine thing called justice. No one in this crowd paid any attention to him. All eyes were focused on a single object, a wooden bench set against a small door in the wall to the left of the presiding judge. On this bench, illuminated by several candles, was a man sitting between two gendarmes. This man was the man. He did not look like him. He did not look for him. He saw him. His eyes went to him naturally as if they knew in advance where that figure was. He thought he saw himself, aged, with not exactly the same features, to be sure, but identical in attitude and appearance, with that bristling hair, those wary brown eyes, that smock, just as he was the day he arrived at D, full of hatred and concealing in his heart that hideous horde of dreadful thoughts he had spent 19 years accumulating in the chain gang. He said to himself with a shudder, God, will I become like that again? This creature looked at least 60. There was something coarse, stupid, and bewildering about him. Hearing the door open, people had moved aside to make room for him. The judge had looked round, and realizing that the individual who had just entered was the mayor of Montreuil-sur-Mer, he had acknowledged him. The public prosecutor, who had seen Monsieur Madeleine at Montreuil-sur-Mer, where he had been called more than once to act in his official capacity, recognized him, and acknowledged him also. He barely noticed. He was in the grip of a kind of hallucination. He kept looking. Magistrates, a clerk, gendarmes, a crowd of cruelly curious faces. He had seen this once already in days gone by, 27 years ago. These ominous things he was re-experiencing. They were here. They were astir. They existed. This was no longer an effort of memory, no mental illusion. These were real gendarmes and real magistrates, a real crowd of real men of flesh and blood. The worst had happened. He saw around him the monstrous aspects of his past, reappearing, reviving, with all the fearsomeness of reality. All this yawned before him. He was horrified. He closed his eyes and cried out in the deepest recesses of his soul, "Never!" And by a tragic twist of fate that made all his thoughts quake and almost drove him mad, it was another incarnation of himself who sat there. The man being tried, everybody called Jean Valjean. He had before his eyes an extraordinary vision, a kind of reenactment of the most horrible moment of his life, played by his ghost. It was all there. The same trappings, the same late hour, almost the same faces of magistrates, soldiers, and spectators. Only above the judge's head there was a crucifix, something that was missing from the courts at the time of his conviction. When he was tried, God was absent. There was a chair behind him. He dropped into it, terrified at the thought that he could be seen. When he was seated, he took advantage of a stack of files that lay on the magistrate's desk to conceal his face from the whole of the room. He could now see without being seen. Little by little he recovered. He fully regained his sense of reality. He reached that stage of composure where it is possible to listen. Monsieur Bamatabois was one of the jurors. He looked for Javert, but did not see him. The witness bench was hidden from him by the clerk's table, and besides, as we have just said, the room was dimly lit. When he had come in, the defendant's lawyer was just finishing his speech. Everyone's attention was as taut as could be. The trial had been going on for 3 hours. For 3 hours this crowd had been watching a man, a nobody, a miserable specimen of humanity, either extremely stupid or extremely crafty, gradually sag beneath the burden of a terrible likeness. This man, as we already know, was a vagrant who had been found in a field carrying away a branch laden with ripe apples, broken off an apple tree in a nearby orchard called the Piron Orchard. Piron Orchard, I suppose. Who was this man? An investigation had been conducted. Witnesses had just been heard. They were unanimous. Some light had emerged from all the proceedings. The prosecution said, "We have here not only a fruit thief, a petty pilferer, we have here a ruffian, a reoffender in breach of the terms of his release, an ex-convict, a most dangerous villain, a criminal named Jean Valjean, long sought by the law, who was 8 years ago on leaving the prison hulks at Toulon, committed highway robbery with threat of violence on the person of a Savoyard child named Petit Gervais. a felony under Article 383 of the Penal Code, for which we reserve the right to try him subsequently when his identity has been legally established. He has now committed another theft. We're dealing here with a repeat offender. Convict him for the recent offense. He will be tried for the previous offenses later. In the face of this charge, in the face of the unanimity of the witnesses, the accused seemed almost surprised. He made no signs and gestures of negation, or else he stared up at the ceiling. Words did not come easily to him. His replies were confused, but his whole person, from head to foot, expressed denial. He was like an idiot in the presence of all these intellects lined up around him, ready to do battle, and like a stranger in the midst of this society that detained him. Yet there was for him the most ominous feature at stake, one that every moment became increasingly likely, and the entire audience regarded with greater apprehension than he himself, this ruinous sentence looming closer and closer. There was even a possibility of not just penal servitude, but a death sentence, to be envisaged if this identity were to be established and the Petit Gervais incident were subsequently to lead to a conviction. What manner of man was this? What was the nature of his unconcern? Was it imbecility or craftiness? Did he understand too well, or did he not understand at all? Questions that divided the crowd and seemed to set the jury at odds. There was in this trial elements of both the terrifying and the intriguing. The drama was not only dark, it was obscure. The defense lawyer had argued his case quite well in that provincial language that has long constituted the eloquence of the bar, and which was formerly used by all lawyers, in Paris as well as at Romorantin or at Montbrison. Now, become antiquated, it is today hardly spoken at all any more except by barristers in court, being suited to them by its solemn ring and majestic style. A language in which a husband is called a spouse and a wife a consort. Paris, the center of art and civilization, the king, the monarch, Monsignor the bishop, a saintly pontiff, the public prosecutor, the eloquent voice of the prosecution, the summing up, the arguments we have just heard, the age of Louis XIV, the great age, a theater, the temple of Melpomene, the ruling family, the august dynasty of our royal sovereigns, a concert, a display of musicianship, Monsieur le Général, commanding officer of the département, the illustrious warrior who, seminary students, these young Levites, errors imputed to newspapers, the deceit that distills its poison in the columns of these organs, etc. So the lawyer had begun by expounding on the apple theft. No easy task, in grandiose style, but Benet Bossuet himself was obliged in the middle of a funeral oration to allude to a chicken, and he acquitted himself magnificently. The lawyer had established the fact that the apple theft was not actually proven. His client, whom he persisted in his capacity as defense counsel in calling Champmathieu, had not been seen by anyone climbing the wall or breaking off the branch. He had been apprehended in possession of that branch, which the lawyer more readily called a bough, but he said he had found it on the ground and picked it up. Where was the proof to the contrary? This branch had undoubtedly been broken off and stolen after the wall had been climbed, then thrown down by the frightened thief. Undoubtedly there was a thief. But what proved that Champmathieu was that thief? One thing only, the fact that he was a convicted felon. The lawyer did not deny that, unfortunately. This fact seemed to be well established. The accused had been resident at Faverolles. The accused had been a tree pruner there. The name of Champmathieu might as well have been Jean Mathieu in origin. All this was true. After all, 4 witnesses, without hesitation, positively identified Champmathieu as the convicted felon Jean Valjean. To counter these arguments, these testimonies, the lawyer could offer only his client's denial, a self-interested denial. But supposing he was the convicted felon, Jean Valjean, did that prove he was the apple thief? That was a presumption at most, not a proof. True, and in good faith, the defense counsel had to admit the prisoner had adopted a poor line of defense. He persisted in denying everything, the theft and the fact that he was a convicted felon. An admission on this last point would surely have been better and would have gained him the leniency of the bench. This was what his lawyer had advised him, but the accused had obstinately refused, thinking no doubt to save everything by admitting nothing. This was wrong, but should not the paucity of his intelligence be taken into consideration? The man was obviously stupid. Interminable misery in prison, interminable hardship out of prison, had addled his wits, etc. He defended himself badly. Was that any reason to convict him? As for the Petit Gervais incident, the lawyer had no need to address that. It was not relevant to this case. The lawyer concluded by entreating the court and the jury, if it seemed to them Jean Valjean's identity had been proven, to apply the legal penalties pertaining to a breach of parole and not the appalling punishment imposed on the convicted felon who reoffends. The public prosecutor responded to the defense counsel. He was fierce and florid, as public prosecutors usually are. He congratulated the defense counsel on his fairness, and skillfully exploited this fairness. With every concession made by his lawyer, he struck a blow against the defendant. The lawyer seemed to admit the defendant was Jean Valjean. He took cognizance of the fact. So this man was Jean Valjean. The point had been conceded at the prosecution and could no longer be disputed. Here, in an adroit use of a rhetorical device, in tracing back the sources and causes of crime, the public prosecutor thundered against the immorality of the then budding Romantic school, referring to it as the Satanic school, a term used by the critics of L'Oriflamme and La Quotidienne, not wholly unreasonable. He attributed to the influence of this perverse literature the crime of Champmathieu, or to be more accurate, of Jean Valjean. Having exhausted these reflections, he moved on to Jean Valjean himself. Who was this Jean Valjean? Description of Jean Valjean, a spewed-up monster, and so on. The model for descriptions of this sort is contained in Théramene's speech, which is of no use to tragedy, but every day renders great service to judicial eloquence. The court and the jury shuddered. His description concluded, the public prosecutor went on with an oratorial flourish calculated to excite the utmost enthusiasm in next morning's Journal de la Préfecture. And it is such a man, a vagrant, a beggar, with no means of existence, inured by a life of crime and little reformed by his sentence of penal servitude, as proved by the offense committed against Petit Gervais, caught red-handed on the public highway, committing theft, a few paces from a scaled wall, still clutching the stolen object. It is such a man who denies the obvious crime, the theft, the climbing of the wall, denies everything, denies even his own name, denies his identity. In addition to countless other proofs that we shall not hark back to, 4 witnesses recognized him. Javert, the upright inspector of police, Javert and 3 of his former companions in ignominy, the convicts Brevet, Chenildieu, and Cochepaille. How does he counter this damning unanimity? With denial. What a hardened criminal. You will deal justly, gentlemen of the jury. While the public prosecutor spoke, the accused listened open-mouthed with a kind of amazement in which there was a considerable element of admiration. He was obviously surprised that a man should be capable of talking like this. From time to time, at the most vigorous moments of the prosecutor's Ooh. From time to time, at the most vigorous moments of the prosecutor's indictment, at those moments when eloquence, unable to contain itself, spills over in a flood of withering epithets and invests the accused like a storm, he slowly moved his head from left to right and from right to left, and sad and silent form of protest with which he had contented himself since the start of the proceedings. 2 or 3 times the spectators seated nearest to him heard him say to himself, "This is what comes of not having asked Monsieur Balou." The public prosecutor directed the attention of the jury to this vacant attitude, which was obviously calculated and an indication of not of imbecility, but of guile, cunning, the habit of eluding justice, and reveling in all its clarity the profound perversity of this man. He concluded by reserving the right to press charges relating to the Petit Gervais incident and demanding a harsh sentence. This was, for the time being, remember, penal servitude for life. The defense counsel rose, began by complimenting Monsieur l'Avocat General on his admirable speech, then responded as best he could, but he was weakening. The ground was evidently being cut from under him. And I think that's all the voice has in it today. Yeah, there's a lot of this trial. This is fun. But I'm going to call it here. Thank you so much for watching live, and to everyone who watches this later on in your own time, hi! You should go to patreon.com/hotdadreads. Patreon.com/hotdadreads. If you want to be able to support the stream with finances and money, be greatly appreciated. If you want to support the stream without finances, maybe both, whatever, make sure you're heading to twitch.tv/hotdadreads and click the little heart in the corner so that way you are following. Do that. That'd be great. Costs you nothing. And we're at 24 right now. Once we get all the way up to 50, then I can monetize the stream. And I'm just going to keep pitching for that till we get there. We'll get there someday. Yeah. Told my poker story. Little girl's teething. We had our 9-month checkup, so that's exciting. Yeah. I got books, I got dad stuff, everything's good. So I hope that you all have yourselves an agreeable evening.